The reception hall in the city's finest hotel was suffocating under the scent of expensive perfumes and manufactured grandeur. 10 years later, the faces of her former classmates looked to Martha like masks worn over eroded memories. Crystal chandeliers flooded the room with an aggressive golden light that shimmered in champagne bubbles and reflected off false smiles. Standing at the edge of the balustrade, her slender fingers tightening around a glass, she felt like an intruder in this triumph of vanity. She wore a gown, the color of the midnight ocean, deep blue satin, that rippled softly with every movement, accentuating the paleness of her skin and the fragility of her shoulders. Martha knew they were whispering behind her back. The rumors set adrift 10 years ago had not dissipated. They remained frozen in the minds of these people like flies in amber. To them, she was still the one who had shattered the dreams of the school's most promising boy, the one whose betrayal had become the legend of their graduating class. He appeared in the doorway suddenly, causing the hum of voices to falter for a moment. Erik had changed so profoundly that Martha's breath caught in her throat. The youthful softness was gone, replaced by a cast-iron strength and a strange, haunting detachment. His face, weathered by wind and salt, looked as if it had been carved from dark stone, and the first threads of silver traced through his thick beard, though he was barely 30. He hadn't worn a tuxedo, opting instead for a sharp but rugged blazer over a dark turtleneck, which made him stand out among the polished men in the room like a wolf among pampered hounds. As he adjusted his cuff, Martha caught a glimpse of an old scar on his wrist, the very one he had earned protecting her so long ago. Beside him, clutching his elbow with a proprietary grip, walked Christina. She gleamed in her snow-white dress, as if reminding everyone present who had emerged victorious in that ancient war. Martha watched as Erik's heavy gaze swept the room until it collided with hers. In that instant, time in the golden hall stood still. In his eyes that had once looked at her with infinite tenderness, the ice of the Arctic had now set. It was the look of a man who had long ago buried his heart beneath a layer of permafrost. There were only 10 meters of carpet between them, yet to Martha, it felt like a yawning abyss of lies and unspoken words. Christina, noticing this silent collision, only pressed closer to her husband, casting a triumphant glance over her shoulder at Martha. She knew her deception had worked perfectly. Erik hadn't just left. He had ripped Martha out of his life, leaving nothing but scorched earth in her wake. The air in the hall became unbearably thin, and Martha realized that the silence between them was screaming louder than any music playing that night. Martha could feel Erik's icy gaze burning her skin more intensely than any fire. She moved toward the bar, struggling to maintain an outward composure, though every step felt laborious, the satin train of her dress heavy, like dragging chains. Near the counter, the air smelled of expensive wood and bitter lemon. Erik was already there, ordering a whiskey. As she drew near, the space between them grew electric. He didn't turn his head, but she saw his broad shoulders tense beneath the fabric of his jacket. Martha ordered a glass of plain water, her voice sounding quiet yet steady. At that moment, Erik set his glass down on the bar with a sharp thud, his fingers long, strong, and marked with the healed cracks of hard labor, were for a fleeting second inches from her hand. She felt a wave of heat radiating from him and caught the faint scent of the sea, a fragrance that felt utterly foreign in this stifling hall. It was the scent of freedom and salt, the scent of the man she had once known and loved beyond reason. The silence between them was broken only by the clinking of ice in his glass. Finally, Erik turned, and Martha saw his eyes up close. There was no hatred in them, only a deep, scorched emptiness that wounded her even more. He looked at her as if she were a ghost from a forgotten nightmare, rather than the woman to whom he had once promised the world. He didn't utter a word, but his gaze slowly traced her face, lingering on her lips, and Martha felt the touch almost physically. In that silence, everything was laid bare. The bitterness of their final quarrel, the weight of 10 years apart, and the shadow of the lie that had poisoned their lives. Suddenly, Christina approached. Her laughter, high-pitched and artificial, sliced through the quiet like a scalpel. She rested her hand on Erik's shoulder, flaunting the large diamond on her finger, and addressed Martha with a voice full of feigned sympathy, asking about her difficult life. Martha didn't offer a reply. She watched as Erik gave a nearly imperceptible flinch at his wife's intrusive presence, yet he still allowed her to lead him away toward the dancing couples. Left alone, Martha stepped out onto the balcony to breathe in the cool night air. There, concealed by the shadow of heavy drapes, she unwittingly became a witness to a conversation. Christina and an old friend of hers stood a short distance away, unaware of Martha's presence. Through the gloom came words that changed her world forever. Snickers about how easy it had been to forge those messages and send the anonymous photos. How simple it was to convince the proud Erik of his beloved's infidelity. Christina boasted of her mastery, of manipulation, calling it the price of her happiness. In that instant, Martha felt something inside her finally snap. Pain was replaced by a cold, crystal-clear resolve. She was no longer a victim of their intrigues. Now she possessed the truth. And that truth demanded not excuses in a stifling ballroom, but an honest confrontation where lies cannot survive in the frozen heart of his new home. A month later, Martha sat behind the wheel of an SUV, slowly navigating through a thick Icelandic fog. The landscape outside her window resembled another planet. Endless fields of frozen lava, carpeted in emerald moss, gave way to jagged cliffs and icy rivers. The air here was so pure, it felt foreign to her lungs. She had left everything behind: her job, her cozy apartment, the clamor of the city, taking with her only a single suitcase, and the truth that seared her heart. The road snaked along the coastline, where the raging Atlantic Ocean crashed its leaden waves against black sands with a thunderous roar. Martha felt the urban bustle shedding off her with every passing kilometer. Like old, dry skin, she was searching for the Reykjanes lighthouse, the place Erik had turned into his bastion of solitude. The closer she drew, the more violently the wind rocked the car, as if nature itself were warning her that there was no turning back to the past. The lighthouse appeared on the horizon, like a slender white finger pointing toward a somber sky. It stood at the very summit of a cliff, buffeted by all the winds, surrounded only by screaming gulls and the rumble of the surf. Martha parked the car at the base and stepped outside. The icy wind struck her face instantly, whipping strands of hair out from under her hood and making her eyes water. She breathed in deeply the scent of salt and wet stone. Here, everything was real, stripped of the glitter and falsehood of that night at the hotel. Before her lay a path leading to the heavy wooden door of the lighthouse. Martha knew Erik was in there, behind those thick walls, hiding from the world that had betrayed him. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the ocean waves. She did not know if he would welcome her or drive her back into the fog, but she was ready for any storm. She began her slow ascent up the trail, feeling the firmness of the ancient earth beneath her feet, knowing that this journey was the only thing in her life that truly mattered. The heavy door of the lighthouse didn't yield at first, as if resisting an intrusion from the outside world. When Martha finally stepped inside, she was greeted by the scent of old wood, hearth smoke, and strong coffee. It was surprisingly warm within. The thick stone walls reliably muffled the roar of the wind, reducing it to a dull, monotonous hum. Erik stood at a massive table cluttered with maps and blueprints. He didn't turn around immediately, likely mistaking her for one of the local suppliers. But as the silence stretched thin, he slowly raised his head. In the dim light of the room, his silhouette appeared even more imposing. He wore a heavy sweater of coarse Icelandic lopi wool that made him look like an extension of the cliffs themselves. When their eyes met, the cup in his hand froze mid-air. The astonishment on his face was quickly replaced by a familiar mask of severity, and his eyes narrowed into two cold slits of steel. He didn't take a single step toward her. The silence was broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant cry of a petrel outside the window. Erik set his cup on the table with a hollow thud and crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for an explanation. Martha stood at the threshold, feeling droplets of icy water drip from her raincoat onto the stone floor. In her city clothes, pale and shivering, she looked entirely out of place. Yet there was a firmness in her posture that he didn't remember. He spoke first, his voice was low and hoarse, unaccustomed to prolonged conversation, vibrating in the air like a roll of distant thunder. He asked what she was doing there, and there wasn't a drop of hospitality in the question. Martha took a step forward into the circle of light from a single lamp, a gesture that felt like a declaration of war or the beginning of a long-awaited peace. She didn't ask for permission to enter or apologize for the intrusion. Martha simply unbuttoned her coat, allowing herself to warm up slightly. She looked directly at him, noting every new line around his eyes and the tightness of his jaw. The tension in the room became almost tangible, thick as an Icelandic fog. She replied that she hadn't traveled 3,000 kilometers just to stand in a doorway, and that they had a conversation 10 years overdue. Erik gave a short, bitter chuckle, glancing at the window where the sky was rapidly bruising into a leaden blue. He walked to the window and slid the heavy iron bolt shut, effectively sealing the two of them inside this stone cocoon. The storm he had predicted by the wind's shift finally struck the walls of the lighthouse with such force that the entire structure shuddered. They were now cut off from the rest of the world, trapped alone with their truth. The evening dissolved into a deep, impenetrable night. Outside, the storm had unleashed its full fury. Waves struck the cliff with such violence that sea spray reached the upper windows of the tower. Inside the lighthouse, the only source of light was the fireplace, its amber flames casting long, grotesque shadows against the stone walls. In silence, Erik motioned Martha toward a chair by the fire and handed her dry clothes, a massive man's shirt made of thick flannel. It carried his scent, pine needles, and pure, sharp cold. She withdrew to a small alcove behind a screen to change, and the rustle of fabric against her skin seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. When she returned and sat by the fire, pulling her knees to her chin, he sat opposite her in the shadows. Only the flickering embers occasionally caught his watchful, heavy gaze. He observed her warming her hands, and the initial rage in his silence had vanished, replaced by the wary anticipation of a predator that senses danger but cannot look away. Between them sat a chessboard with an unfinished game, likely one he had been playing against himself. Martha reached out and moved one of the pieces, disrupting his perfect order. The gesture served as a signal. She began to speak. At first, her voice trembled, eclipsed by the howl of the wind in the chimney. But gradually, it grew steady. She spoke of that night 10 years ago, of the letters he had never received, and of the words Christina had whispered into his ear while he was blinded by pain. Erik listened without interruption, his face a motionless mask, but Martha saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. Every word she uttered fell into the stillness of the room like a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. She offered no excuses. She was simply returning to him the fragments of reality that had been stolen from his life. When she finished, a silence so profound settled over the room that one could hear the ash settling in the hearth. Erik rose slowly and walked toward her. He stopped, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. In the gloom, his silhouette eclipsed all light, and for a moment, Martha felt a flicker of fear, not of his anger, but of the raw power of the emotions awakening within him. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from her cheek. She saw the struggle within him, his pride colliding with the realization of a monstrous mistake. In his eyes, the ice began to fracture, revealing a raw, unbearable ache beneath. He did not touch her, but that unmade contact was more intimate than any kiss. The air between them turned hot, almost searing, and in that space at the edge of the world, the old lies finally burned away, leaving behind nothing but a pure, primal attraction. The storm did not subside. It merely traded its fury for a monotonous, heavy siege. Erik stepped away from Martha and moved to a small escritoire, fishing out a crumpled pack of cigarettes he kept only for nights like this. Martha asked about Christina, a short question that hung in the air, like a heavy lead weight. Erik chuckled, and there was more exhaustion in the sound than malice. He explained that their marriage was nothing more than a stage set that suited them both. Christina had her status and the bank accounts he diligently filled, and in return, he had earned the right to solitude here among the cliffs, where no one demanded smiles or words of love. She never came to Iceland. To her, the island was a frozen hell, while to him, it had become the only place where the silence did not feel like a lie. Martha realized then that all these years, he hadn't just been living apart, he had been punishing himself with this exile, believing he deserved nothing but the cold and the salt. The words about Christina finally shattered the last remains of awkwardness. There was no longer a third party in the room, only two people who had once been everything to one another. Erik walked to the hearth and tossed a few logs of ocean-bleached driftwood into the fire. The flames flared with renewed strength, illuminating his face. He confessed that every morning, as he watched the churning ocean, he saw her face in the foam of the waves, and that vision was his personal curse. He had hated her for her betrayal, but he hated himself even more for never being able to purge her from his blood. Now that the truth was laid bare, the hatred accumulated over 10 years began to transform rapidly into something else, a hunger that could no longer be concealed. His gaze grew heavy. He no longer hid the desire that pulsed in time with the waves crashing against the cliff. Martha stood up, her shadow flickering against the wall. She stepped toward him until the toes of her borrowed boots brushed against his heavy ones. In the cramped intimacy of the lighthouse, amid the scent of smoke and the rising heat of the fireplace, social conventions ceased to exist. She reached out and touched the scar on his wrist, the one he had received in their youth. Her fingers were cool, but his skin was searing. This first conscious touch acted like an electric shock. Erik exhaled sharply, his palm covering her hand, pressing it against his body. He looked down at her with a tenderness so fierce it made Martha's head spin. In this gesture lay everything: the bitterness of a lost decade and the promise that this night would be their redemption. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in, leaving room for no one but the two of them. The tension that had accumulated over long years finally reached its zenith, but now its very nature had shifted. Erik took a step toward her, a movement as profound as the shifting of tectonic plates. He did not touch her immediately, but Martha felt the space between them thicken, becoming hot and visceral, like molten wax. His breath, ragged and heavy, brushed against her temple, and the scent of salt and fire-warmed wood enveloped her, stripping away her will to resist. In the flickering light of the hearth, his silhouette appeared monumental, when his hand, large, calloused, and accustomed to rough labor, finally came to rest upon her neck. Martha felt a jolt of searing recognition surge through her body. It was the touch of a man who had found a treasure he believed was lost forever. He slowly traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, compelling her to lift her head and meet his gaze. There was no more ice in his eyes, only a bottomless, dark tenderness and a silent question, to which she responded by leaning forward ever so slightly. Their closeness in this moment was devoid of haste. It was like the slow dance of shadows upon the stone walls of the lighthouse. Erik gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and that simple movement in the silence of the room resonated louder than any confession. The flannel shirt, too broad in the shoulders, rustled softly as he drew her to him, closing the final millimeters that separated their two worlds. Martha pressed her cheek against his chest, listening to the hollow, powerful thud of his heart, which echoed the rhythm of the ocean surf outside the window. They sank onto a wide armchair, draped in heavy furs, remaining within the golden circle of light from the dying embers. The entire scene was built on contrasts: the softness of her skin beneath his rough fingers, the fragility of her silhouette within the ring of his powerful arms. The moments focused on micro-movements, the way their fingers interlaced, how his lips barely grazed her forehead and closed eyelids, and how she caught her breath with every exhale he made. This was passion translated into the language of gestures and tactile sensations. In every movement, there was a sense of redemption for the years of separation. Outside the lighthouse walls, the elements raged, but here, in this cocoon of warmth and truth, time slowed down, turning their embrace into a quiet harbor where two broken hearts finally began to beat in unison, healing one another without a single word. The flames on the hearth had collapsed into a heap of shimmering embers, veiled by a thin layer of gray ash. The silence that had descended upon the lighthouse after the storm was almost tactile outside the walls. The ocean had traded its furious roar for a weary, rhythmic murmur. In the pre-dawn twilight, the room filled with a cold, bluish light that fell softly upon the heavy folds of the blankets and the interlaced hands of the two figures. Martha lay still, feeling the steady, deep rise and fall of Erik's breath. His palm still rested on her shoulder, as if even in sleep he was guarding her presence, fearing that the dawn might prove to be nothing more than another mirage. In this hour, before the world outside had regained its sharp edges, the past, the noisy halls, Christina's caustic laughter, and the years spent in the concrete jungle seemed distant and unreal, like the stage sets of a movie watched long ago. Erik opened his eyes suddenly, with the alertness of someone whose life has depended for years on the fickle moods of the elements. He did not pull away. Instead, he drew Martha closer, searching her face in the gloom. In his gaze, now stripped of its protective armor of severity, lay a quiet wonder. He slowly traced the tips of his fingers along her arm, as if testing whether the skin beneath his touch was truly so warm and alive. This night had done more than just return them to one another. It had erased a decade of distance, reducing it to nothing. He understood that beyond the threshold of the lighthouse, the real world awaited them with its complex decisions and legal entanglements. But here and now, in this stone cocoon at the edge of the earth, only one truth existed. They were no longer alone in their exile. Martha turned toward him, and in the morning dusk, her eyes looked like dark lakes brimming with hope. She asked no questions about the future, for the answer was written in every one of Erik's movements, in the tender way he touched her hair. Outside, the dawn began to stain the horizon with soft pink and golden hues, piercing through the remnants of the fog. This light was mercilessly honest. It laid bare the fine lines around his eyes and the paleness of her face. Yet, in this nakedness of emotion, there was an authentic beauty that no silks or gold could ever replace. Erik brushed her forehead with a brief, almost weightless kiss that became a silent vow. They lay in silence, listening to the island wake up, as the ash in the fireplace finally cooled, giving way to a new day that promised to be the first of their new, shared life. Morning had fully asserted its rights by the time they stepped out onto the lighthouse's narrow terrace. The air was bitingly cold, and so translucent that it felt as though one could see the very edge of the world. Below, the black sand of the beach lay perfectly smooth after the storm, gleaming like obsidian beneath a thin veil of water. The ocean, which only recently had tried to crush the cliffs, now humbly licked the shore, leaving behind laces of white foam and tangled ribbons of kelp. Erik stood by the railing, baring his face to the sharp northern wind. He was back in his coarse wool sweater, looking like an inseparable part of this landscape. Martha followed, wrapping herself in his jacket, which smelled of tobacco and freedom. She gazed at this wild, primordial land and, for the first time in her life, felt that she was exactly where she belonged. They began their descent down the steep, winding path leading to the foot of the cliff. Every step on the damp earth and moss required effort, but Erik led the way, always ready to offer a shoulder or reach out a hand. When they reached the black beach, the silence here proved to be of a different kind, filled with the powerful roar of the surf. They walked along the tide line, past twisted driftwood and shards of blue ice cast ashore by the storm. These icy monoliths sparkled in the sun like massive, uncut diamonds. The walk felt like a ritual of catharsis. Icy spray stung their skin, and the wind swept the last remnants of doubt from their minds. Martha picked up a smooth black stone from the sand, polished by millennia, and felt its weight as substantial and real as their feelings. Erik stopped at the water's very edge and turned to her. He spoke of how life here would not be easy. Iceland does not forgive weakness, and his past still trailed behind him like a long shadow. But looking into his eyes, Martha saw no fear, only a readiness to meet any challenge. She stepped close, and they stood motionless against the backdrop of an infinite horizon where the leaden sky merged with the ocean. In this place, stripped of urban clamor and the whispers of others, everything had become profoundly simple. The truth she had carried with her across half the world had finally found its soil. She knew that their story was only beginning. It was no longer a fairy tale of love, but a saga of two people who had proven stronger than their own fate. The idyll of the lull was shattered on the third day, when the sky over the coast became unnaturally clear and the ocean settled into a mirror-like stillness. The sound of a foreign engine sliced through the coastal silence suddenly and sharply, like the screech of metal on glass. At that moment, Martha and Erik were on a small pier, helping each other secure the rigging on an old boat. When a white SUV appeared on the crest of the hill, Erik froze, his face instantly transforming into the stone mask Martha had seen the night of their first reunion. The vehicle came to a halt, and Christina stepped out. She looked absurd in her pristine white fur coat and high-heeled boots, which immediately began to sink into the soft black sand. Her presence here felt like a toxic stain on the clean canvas of the Icelandic landscape. She walked toward them, her eyes contemptuously surveying the weathered walls of the lighthouse and the rusted chains of the pier. Every movement she made was infused with a rage, carefully disguised as social arrogance. Christina had not expected to find Martha here, so close to Erik, and when their eyes met, a flash of hatred ignited in the wife's gaze, a malice that could no longer be hidden behind a fake smile. She began speaking from a distance. Her voice, usually melodic, now sounded harsh and shrill, punctuated by the roar of the surf. She accused Erik of madness, of trading their status for this wasteland, and of allowing that woman to desecrate their lives once more. Christina was certain of her power over him, believing the old threads of lies and legal obligations still held a firm grip on his throat. Erik did not utter a single word until she stood directly before him. He simply stayed there, his hand resting on Martha's shoulder, a calm, protective gesture that infuriated Christina more than any verbal insult could have. When she finally fell silent, gasping from the cold air and her own fury, Erik looked at her as if he were seeing a complete stranger. There was no resentment in his gaze, no urge to argue, only an endless exhaustion from the long comedy he had been forced to perform. He spoke only one sentence, quiet but heavy as the strike of a hammer. He told her she was 10 years too late, and that here, on this shore, her words no longer carried any weight. He looked at her not as a wife, but as a tedious nuisance that prevented him from breathing freely. Infuriated, Christina tried to strike where it hurt most. She began once again to speak of Martha's betrayal, shouting out the old details of that fabricated lie. But this time, the script did not go according to her plan. Martha stepped forward, moving out from behind Erik's shoulder. She did not scream, and she did not cry. With icy composure, she recounted the very words she had overheard on the balcony. During the reunion, every word Christina had uttered about the forged letters and the manipulations. In the silence of the Icelandic shore, this confession rang out like a death sentence. Christina faltered for a moment, her face blooming with crimson splotches as her carefully constructed image of wronged virtue began to crumble, exposing the shallow, frightened soul of a woman who had built her happiness upon the misery of others. Erik turned slowly toward Christina. Now, In his eyes, there flared the same flame Martha had seen in the hearth that night, but this was a fire of purification. He did not cause a scene. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a ring of keys, and placed them on the weathered planks of the pier. It was a gesture of final severance, not just from her, but from the entire world she personified. He told her she could take it all: the house, the accounts, the cars, everything she had clung to so desperately. He no longer needed that alibi for his solitude. Christina looked at the keys, then at Martha, and for the first time, a flash of total realization crossed her eyes. She understood that no amount of money and no web of lies could restore her power over a man who had found the strength to forgive and to love once more. Christina left as abruptly as she had appeared. She almost ran back to her car, stumbling over the stones and never looking back. When the sound of her SUV finally died away in the distance, silence reigned over the shore once more. But now it was crystal clear. Erik and Martha remained on the pier, gazing out at the boundless ocean. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if a weight of many tons had just been lifted from them. He turned to Martha and took her face in his palms. His fingers still smelled of salt and aged timber, but now there was an absolute boundless freedom in his touch. The past was officially over. Here, amid the ice and the black sand, they were left alone to begin writing their own story. A story where shadows no longer had a place. After Christina's departure, the lighthouse seemed to exhale in relief. A few weeks passed, and the harsh Icelandic winter began to slowly assert its dominance, blanketing the lava fields in a thin layer of crisp frost. Martha and Erik's lives settled into a measured rhythm, dictated by nature itself. Mornings began with thick fog creeping in from the ocean, and the scent of freshly ground coffee mingling with the aroma of juniper in their cozy kitchen. They no longer looked back. All legal documents had been sent by mail, all bridges burned, and the ash of old grievances finally scattered over the Atlantic. Now, their world was bounded only by the circle of light, from the lighthouse lens and the warmth of each other's hands. In this seclusion, Martha found a new purpose for her art. Her sketches on black paper, rendered in white charcoal, captured the soul of this land better than any words ever could. They spent their evenings in the tower's upper gallery, where the massive lantern rotated slowly, slicing through the nocturnal gloom with a powerful golden beam. Erik taught Martha the subtleties of the mechanics, how to listen to the pulse of this great machine, how to read the language of the clouds, and how to predict the onset of snowstorms. In these moments, a rare harmony reigned between them, the kind born only after great trials. They could sit for hours in silence on a narrow bench, gazing at stars that seemed so low one could reach out and touch them. This silence held no emptiness. It was filled with the realization that they were finally home. Every accidental brush of shoulders, every exchange of glances in the dim light of the gallery was a confirmation of their unspoken covenant, a union of two people who chose the truth over a comfortable lie. One night, when the sky above the cliff erupted in emerald flashes of the northern lights, they stepped out onto the open balcony just beneath the lantern. Green and violet ribbons of light danced over the ocean, reflected in the dark pupils of Erik's eyes. He embraced Martha from behind, shielding her from the piercing wind within the folds of his heavy coat. This gesture contained his entire essence: the protector, the guardian, the man who had found his lost harbor. Martha pressed against him, feeling the icy air sear her lungs, while her heart overflowed with an incredible warmth. She knew there would be long winters ahead, storms that would cut them off from civilization and grueling labor. But looking at that celestial fire, she understood. The storm in his blood had finally stilled, transforming into the steady, eternal flame of the lighthouse that would guide them for the rest of their lives.